Welcome to my virtual synthesizer museum. I've been asked to come and talk about my collection of synthesizers and my album 20 Systems, which is like my kind of history of how synthesizers evolved. What I'm going to talk about is how the idea for my album 20 Systems came together, and then a bit of kind of background about how synthesizers work and how you patch them, things like that. And then I'm going to talk about the development of synths over the years, play a few tracks off the album which kind of illustrate with music how they evolved. Back in the early 1990s, personal computers started to become the centre of people's studios, and everyone kind of got rid of their hardware. I was more interested in the discarded hardware, so I started buying any old cheap synthesizer that I could, and some people were kind of chucking stuff out, and I'd get hold of it and keep everything that I got, basically. I ended up with a room full of instruments, some of which are now quite sort of collectible. At some point I decided that I wanted to record an album just using one synthesizer per track and no other kind of effects or anything, just the sound of that one synthesizer. And I was sitting in my studio and looked around, and I wonder if I've got one synth from every year from, you know, the whole period that synthesizers were developed. And actually I sort of realised that I did have that, and that's how the kind of whole idea of the album came together. It's like a concept album, sort of about the idea of this development. What makes synthesizers so unique is the concept of automatic control. This is very easy to see with modular systems because you have to make all the connections yourself by plugging in cables and things. The very first systems were made in the 1960s, and here is my Moog system from 1968. Okay, so next up is a synth from the same era as this, but it has a completely different way of connecting the modules together. You have to use these little switches and sliders here instead of cables, but in principle it's the same kind of effect. The next one is a British synth called the VCS3, which is a small modular synth, and you have a different system again of patching it with little pins that you stick in a matrix here to connect the different modules together. One more to show you, which is an American synth from 1972, I think, called the Surge Modular. And this one uses patch cables, but this time you can plug a patch cable in the back of another one and create multiple outputs from one source. I'm going to play some excerpts from the album 20 Systems that I made and show you some pictures of them, of the synths that I used on them. Hopefully you'll see how the synthesizers evolved over the years between this first period that I've just shown you of 1967 until the late 80s, when personal computers and all-in-one synthesizer workstations kind of replaced what we're seeing here as normal synthesizers. The album starts in 1968 with the Moog modular, which I showed you first. Then on through the early 70s with the other systems, modular systems. I'll skip forward a few years to a synth that represented a change from these large modulars to smaller monosynths. And this was an era when synthesizers became much more popular and sort of people could afford to buy them, and you'd have a synthesizer player in pretty much every band then. I'd just like to point out that on the album, every sound is made on just one synth. There are no external effects or sequencers used, but I did allow myself to overdub and layer the sounds on top of themselves, so I built up the tracks that way. This is one of these very early monosynths from 1973. A Roland SH2000. 1974, someone had the good idea to connect 4 monosynths together and create the first polysynth. This was called the Oberheim 4-voice, and what it meant you could do was play more voices than one at a time. In other words, play chords on them. So the next period of history was all about polyphonic synthesis, and all manufacturers started making polysynths. The next track is the Moog Polymoog, which I made by playing along to a click track and overdubbing several layers of the sound together. The next development that came along was at the end of the 1970s, when manufacturers started putting small computer chips into the synths. The computers were used to do things like store sounds and sequence sounds, and because of the digital control of analog, they were called hybrid systems. The next piece is a Yamaha CS70M, one of the last breed of Yamaha analog synths. Early 80s, several companies started to produce elaborate and very expensive systems that were completely digital. The 2 biggest ones were in fact based around mainframe computers and probably cost about the same as the average house, or more probably. The next piece was made on a Fairlight CMI, computer music instrument. And as you can see in this picture, it has a keyboard and a screen with a light pen, and you can draw complex waveforms in real time on the screen and hear it as it evolves in real time. Next I'm going to show you a Yamaha system. Yamaha had always produced analogue keyboards, as I showed you before, but in the 1980s they seemed to be a bit old-fashioned compared to all the computer systems that had been developed. So what they came out with was their own digital synth that they've been working on in secret for 10 years. It's called the DX7 and it became the biggest selling synth of all time. A few years later, in 1985, they released a computerized version of the DX7 called the CX5, and on it you could compose and sequence sounds for a fraction of the price of the other systems that I showed you. By the end of the 1980s, you could buy a system that you could record a whole album on, including every instrument and every sound you wanted, using the built-in hard disk recorder. In 1986, the synclavier cost $200,000, but I got my system free, basically, because someone was throwing it away. The downside is that it's really big and heavy. The main processor is 5 feet tall. This patch is quite a simple thing I made using the built-in arpeggiator. So you just hold down keys on the keyboard and the arpeggiator sequences through them automatically. So in conclusion, when I started recording the tracks for this album, I really wanted to try and let the systems generate the music by themselves. It's the self-reliability which is the really unique feature of a synthesizer. But as I went along recording, I found it was more interesting musically if I let a little bit of my input guide the synthesizers and the arrangements. And so in the end, what I settled on was a kind of collaboration between me and the machines. And that was the most interesting thing that I learnt by doing it, that these amazing machines have been created for us to interact with them. And that is why I continue to play with them and why they continue to inspire me to keep making music.